Hi, today I'm taking a look at an exciting new release. This is the 2019 vintage of Esk Valley's The Terraces from Hawkes Bay, also known as Heipipi vineyard. The Terraces is something of an iconic Hawkes Bay wine. It's one of a small number of premium Bordeaux blends from the region. Only made in tiny amounts, and it's from a single site in the Bayview part at the north of the wine growing area of Hawkes Bay. Quite an unusual site in that it's a limestone hillside that is, not surprisingly, is terraced. The terraces were first cut into the hillside in the 1940s by a previous owner, somebody called John Bird, who had this idea that this would be a fantastic site for vine growing. Prior to that, the area had been, there's evidence of habitation back through Maori times for about 500 years. So it's probably one of the earlier sites of habitation in the Hawkes Bay area. Unfortunately, the Glenvale winery that first terraced the vineyards didn't succeed with it as a vineyard. It was too expensive to work, and they were trying to produce fortified wines, largely from hybrid grape varieties. So that was a poor idea. They ripped those out and they planted pine trees. Move on to the late 80s, and the winery was bought by George Fistanich, who founded and built up Villa Maria, and George renamed the winery Esk Valley and decided to make this premium wine from what he perceived to be an excellent site on the Terraces vineyard. So the pine trees were pulled out, vines were replanted, and Gordon Russell, quite individualistic winemaker who ran Esk Valley, has been making this wine since 1991. They don't make it every year. If the quality was insufficient, it would be sold off to go into their bulk blends. Quantities, as I say, are tiny. For instance, quite a small vintage in 2019, and I think they made 190 cases. It's just been released on the market. So let's have a look at the wine. It's a wine that's spent, I believe, 18 months aging in oak, a proportion of which will be new, probably about 50%. And one of its more unusual features, as I think I mentioned, is that the wine is predominantly Malbec, with a fairly large amount also of Merlot and Cabernet Franc. They don't actually give the portions of the different varietals on the label, because the entire production is picked in one day. So all the varieties are picked at the same time, and they're co-fermented. This started in 2002 with Gordon, the winemaker, following some of the ideas of the Alsatian winemaker Marcel Diess, who was doing similar things with white wines in Alsace. So the idea of that being to preserve the unique character of this exceptional vineyard more fully by sort of just harvesting everything in one day to give a snapshot of the conditions in the vintage. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? The first thing to note, really lovely deep colour. I mean, there's a darkness to the pigmentation. The ruby red has a lovely purple hue around the rim, where there's a slight lightening, but in honesty, it holds its colour very well to the rim. Not quite dark enough to be opaque, but yeah, relatively darkly pigmented. So let's have a smell, shall we? The aromas are complex, they're quite powerful. They're slightly closed up, but there's an awful lot going on in there. You've got a core of red fruit, ripe red fruit, ripe plum, almost to a sort of a prune over ripeness, and behind that there are sort of notes of white pepper. I suspect that's coming from oak, so that's sort of probably a little bit of cedriness coming there. Overlaying everything, there's a sort of a milkiness as well. There are slight meaty notes, and right in the middle of it there's a sort of core of dense fruit, almost sort of red licorice, and then with a almost more to a sort of a dark, bitter licorice note as well, just on the aromas. So let's taste it and see what we think of that. The wine is big and rich, and that's not surprising. The alcohol stated on the label is 14.5%. There are plenty of tannins. They give a velvety roundness to the texture, and there is some grainy bite to it as well. And from the graininess there's coming a sort of a peppery note as well. The fruit is very much as it was on the nose. You're getting that red fruit, maybe slightly less of the overripe prune note, possibly because there's quite good acidity coming through and pepping everything up. But again, there's a milky smoothness. There's really smoothing out the mid palate beautifully. But there are meaty notes. There's something slightly wild about Malbec that makes it sort of meaty and a little bit animal. Not in a nasty, mousy way, but in quite a sort of an attractive, juicy fruit sort of way. But it's slightly more of a cooked fruit than a sort of a fine, elegant fruit that you might get with a Cabernet or something like that. It's characterful, it's rich. The finish is rounded. The acidity is not particularly high at the end, so you've got the structure, not particularly drying, but with enough grip. You've got weight, you've got spiciness coming out there, and the sort of spicy meatiness wrapped around the concentration of the fruit is showing now. It's that sort of, there's a bitter licorice note to the finish that's sort of showing its intensity, showing there's plenty more to open up here. And yes, it's a wine where there's an awful lot going on. It's a very young wine. I've decanted this about an hour and a half ago, so it's had a little bit of time to open up. But a recent tasting I did of all the vintages of the terraces going back to 1991, the first vintage, all those wines were still showing plenty of life and vivacity. And I mean, this certainly I would think would very happily age for 20 years, although it is actually lovely and accessible now as a young wine. But yes, a really interesting wine. Not hugely expensive. I mean, it's only just been released, as I say, and in some markets I've seen this at sort of the equivalent of 75, 80 US dollars. So if you can get it at that sort of price, I think that's a bit of a bargain. And there were, as I say, very little bit made, only about 190 cases. So yes, the 2019 vintage of Esk Valley's The Terraces, well worth looking out for. Cheers everybody, bye now.